Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. Thanks so much for tuning in. I want to say a special thanks to our producers, Jason Stark and Taylor Turzek. They put in so much work behind the scenes, and we appreciate them. And also to Alan Files, who puts in a lot of work behind the scenes, especially when things go wrong with the website, but also maintenance of the website as well, as James Steinbach, who helps out there as well. So thanks to both of them. If you get the chance to share the word about OnScript, please do so on whatever platform you can do that. That really helps us. Otherwise, enjoy the episode. And if you'd like to donate to OnScript, you can do so at onscript.study/donate. Thanks for listening.
Well, welcome to another episode of OnScript. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Timothy Brookins. He's professor of early Christianity at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. And we're going to be discussing today his 2024 monograph, Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Corinthians, Paul, Stoicism, and Spiritual Hierarchy, published with Eerdmans. You may have heard of him before, because this work serves as a sequel, a revision, an update to his acclaimed 2014 monograph, Corinthian Wisdom, Stoic Philosophy, and the Ancient Economy, which was an SNTS book published with Cambridge. And it's such, this 2024 book is so well organized and argued. It's so crisply written. It's a model, really, for how books should be argued, how an argument should be executed. And it leads the reader straight back to the text, to exegesis. It insists consistently on the importance of exegesis. And so this is rightly being hailed as a hugely important work in the development of scholarship on 1 Corinthians, and therefore, of course, Paul generally. So it's a real privilege to speak to you today. Timothy, welcome to OnScript.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here.
Well, maybe you could just start by telling us a bit about your journey into biblical scholarship, especially how your interest in the wisdom of the Corinthians first emerged.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I had taken Latin all the way through school, and it's interesting, it sort of started there. This is a story of how classics and biblical studies intersected for me in a way that seemed accidental, but I think was probably providential. So having a Latin background, through college even, biblical studies was not yet a twinkle in my eye. All I knew was that I wanted to attend seminary and had planned to become a youth pastor. So upon starting seminary, however, I quickly discovered that I did not want to be a youth pastor. And my love of biblical studies, particularly at the beginning, biblical languages, came alive as I saw how it related to my study of Latin much earlier on. And so from that point, I decided to pursue a PhD, and the question was whether I wanted to do it in classics or in New Testament. And after wavering a bit, I decided on New Testament and headed to Baylor, where I started a PhD in 2008. And during my first semester, I very quickly realized how much biblical studies and classics would intersect. And my first semester, I simultaneously took seminars on 1 Corinthians and a Latin course on Seneca's letters. And I started to draw some connections that eventually led me to my dissertation topic on 1 Corinthians, the Corinthian church, and the background of that letter in relation to Stoicism.
Now, what you can't see on the podcast, I think I can make it out anyway, is the Loeb classical library editions. There's a lot of them in the background here.
Yeah, that was not intentional, but
I mean, you really do bring all of that learning to the table, don't you? Excellently with this particular contribution. So, what is your argument in a nutshell? Let's just say you've got a couple of minutes to explain it to an educated MA student, they've done a course in biblical studies. Maybe they've read some Greek language commentaries. Commentaries on the Greek text of Corinthian correspondence. What is your elevator pitch in a nutshell?
Yes. So focusing on 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, as I do in the monograph. In these chapters are all more or less about wisdom. Paul is discoursing about wisdom, but he's talking in a negative way about what he alternately calls a human wisdom or a wisdom of this world, where Paul doesn't actually elsewhere use wisdom language very often. This has led many interpreters, or most interpreters, to believe that there was particularly a problem in the Corinthian church about some wisdom that they were enamored with or had espoused. And over the history of modern interpretation, there have been many ideas about what kind of wisdom this was, whether it was to be related with Greek philosophy or a popular philosophy, some kind of Hellenistic religiosity, or some other ideology, and most recently with the wisdom of eloquence, the ability to speak well, as people learned in school. And so what I argue in this book, there are elements of through the history of modern interpretation, but nobody develops it in the sort of specific way that I do. And what I'm doing is very different from recent trends, particularly since the 1980s and 90s, in reconstructing the wisdom of the Corinthians. So what I argue is that there were some in the Corinthian church, not all, but who espoused this wisdom and were calling themselves wise men, and understood themselves as wise men in a Stoic-like way that I'll call sub-Stoicism. So it's this particular wisdom that Paul is opposing, not necessarily all wisdom or higher learning or anything like that. But the second component of this in chapters 1 through 4 of 1 Corinthians is that this wisdom somehow intertwines with a problem of factionalism. So Paul tells us in 1:12, some of you say I'm of Paul, others I'm of Apollos, others I'm of Cephas, and others I am of Christ. And so the trick through the history of interpretation has been not only to explain what this wisdom was, but also how it relates to the factions.
Thank you for answering so well, because I completely butchered the question. I was almost tempted to stop and let's just redo that. So thank you. Now, your new book, this Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Corinthians, is a sequel, as you say, of sorts to your earlier work that I mentioned earlier on. Could you summarize, without too many spoilers, because we're going to get into the details, could you summarize what's new in this book and how your thinking has evolved?
Yes, it's a great question because my thinking has evolved some, as I mentioned in the preface, although the main or essential thesis remains pretty much the same. And so what I had argued in the 2014 monograph that came out of my dissertation, one was an argument against the going interpretation of this wisdom, that it was a wisdom of rhetoric or an obsession with the sophistic movement. And I tackle that largely through a semantic argument and tracing wisdom language in Greek and Roman sources, the language of Sophia and Sophos in Greek, sapientia and sapiens in Latin. And so there it's largely a negative argument against the rhetorical thesis initially. The second part of that work was to trace certain themes that I think recur in the letter and that recur in what we know of the Corinthians' perspective based on places where Paul seems to quote the Corinthians, what we call the Corinthian slogans. So looking at their slogans, some other language that's embedded in the letter from the Corinthians, and some of the recurring topics, I identify some themes that I think experimentally I look through the problems in the letter from chapters 1 to 15. And I argue that many of these problems, there's a recurring theme that can be traced to doctrines that are distinctive of Stoicism. So what I wasn't able to do in that monograph, because I was doing a sweeping look at the entire letter, is really focus in and do, for one, a proper exegesis that really tested this at a granular level. And so the new monograph focuses in on chapters 1 through 4 as opposed to the entire letter, and spends about 40% of the book doing an exegesis of these in the way that a good Greek level commentary would, testing current theories or reconstructions about what's happening in chapters 1 through 4 as I begin to test and build a case for my own thesis. So the second thing that's different is that I look at the Corinthians' Stoic-like view, or their sub-Stoicism, at a more technical level of Stoic doctrine. And then finally, I offer a more developed reconstruction of how their wisdom relates to the factions, the nature of those factions. And this is where I differ even from my 2020 commentary. I argue here that it was the Paul faction, in fact, that were the wise men, and that they had interpreted him in such a way that led to their sub-Stoicism, although I think Paul would have said they had misinterpreted him.
Yeah, brilliant. And we're going to come to that point, I hope, towards the end, where you really nail this down. And I think it's the last chapter. The book is structured into three parts. So maybe we'll just dive straight into the first part, which is rediscovering the wisdom of the Corinthians, where you're looking at modern scholarship and some methodological issues. And I found this particularly challenging. I mean, it was going over some older ground that you covered in your first monograph, but I must admit I used to be quite swayed by the honor-shame approach, patrons and clients. So this was a very helpful overview of modern scholarship on 1 Corinthians 1-4. Can you outline some of the dominant trends in the scholarship on those chapters, and why you believe that the recent consensus has missed the mark?
Yeah, so there's a particular stage in the history of interpretation of 1 Corinthians that has a lot to do with broader trends and what's been happening in biblical studies since, say, the 1970s. And one line is the socio-historical line, or sociological interpretations, really initiated by people like Wayne Meeks, and in 1 Corinthians also Gerd Tyson, that have pointed out to us that ideas are embedded in particular cultures and are often driven by behaviors. And so there's been a tendency from that point to rightly look at the Corinthian problem through things like cultural conventions that were common at that particular time, like a patron-client system. Another trend that's been prevalent since around the same time is looking at the biblical text through the categories of ancient rhetoric, what we call rhetorical criticism. And I think it's partly also the interest in rhetorical criticism that led scholars to look anew at 1 Corinthians and say, I wonder here if it's an infatuation with rhetoric that's in fact the problem in the church and the wisdom that they've espoused. And so in looking at this, of course, there are some very important and valid advances that have been made through these methods, including on 1 Corinthians. What I found with studies in these lines on 1 Corinthians, though, is that they initially presented themselves as trying to, quote unquote, supplement other interpretations by saying there are some sociological factors here in the controversy in addition to theological factors. But what I also saw is that they were offering at the same time a new sociological interpretation for those very passages that were once interpreted in sort of theological terms. So it didn't seem to me that they were really supplementing so much as trying to supplant. But what you see is each time a new insight is made on the text, nobody wants to abandon earlier insights, because the more people you disagree with, the more this is an obstacle to publication and acceptance of your thesis. And so as I began to read Corinthian scholarship, I began to see a real fragmentation of insights on the text, where so many different things were happening based on incorporating the insights of different studies that I couldn't see how you could integrate that all into a coherent picture, how that made sense of 1 Corinthians 1-4 as a coherent discourse, and how that led to a kind of coherent reconstruction of the occasion. And so I think what it required was less exegesis of those chapters in order to be able to make those cases. And as I began to test those theories, began to see that these theories only work if you sort of neglect the fine points, how propositions are connected to each other through conjunctions like de and gar, and how if we look at this not just at the level of sentences and paragraphs and themes, then something else emerges. And so I identify in studies what I call an approach that looks at the background of the text rather than a background of the text. And what I'm intending to capture is how studies will often spend 50, 100, 200 pages tracing a particular background or social convention, something like the history of ancient rhetoric or the history of patronage practices. And then we'll spend a very small portion of a book applying that to what they see happening in the text. And I wanted to reverse that, and rather than having a background of the text, having a background of the text and beginning with exegesis and looking at the problem anew.
Yeah, wonderful. I very much resonated with that strategy. I sought to do something very similar in Paul's Divine Christology. Now, chapter 2 addresses some methodological concerns, including the challenge of comparing these two concepts. On the one hand, Stoicism, and then the Corinthian Sophia. There's a lot going on here. You speak of sub-Stoicism as a way forward. Can you explain this?
Yeah, and this is a very important chapter because part of the trends of the last 50 years has been away from a kind of comparative religion approach to New Testament ideas, New Testament theology, going back especially to a seminal article by Samuel Sandmel about parallelomania, a tendency to identify verbiage that's shared between Greco-Roman texts and New Testament texts. And with that has come a reluctance to identify anything in the New Testament distinctively with some kind of external Greek or religious system. And so what I try to do in the book is to develop a more sophisticated way of comparing that builds on recent work by Max Lee in his book on moral transformation in the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition. What he does is he looks at ancient philosophical schools where they were quite sectarian, and you tended to identify with one particular school and to swear allegiance to the teaching of the founder of that particular school. And so there wasn't actually much eclecticism going on, even though that's a term that's often thrown about. What Lee does is he says, let's look at the dynamics of the way in which rivaling philosophical schools interacted with each other. And in that book, he lays out 6 different ways of interacting with the material of a rival school. Right? You could refute the teachings of that school, but you could also, in a number of different ways, incorporate the teachings of that school. You could do it more competitively, or you could do it more ironically, and so on. In a later article, Lee adds a 7th category that he calls doctrinal reformulation. And this would be where, say, a member of a particular philosophical school, say a Platonist, doctrinally reformulated the teachings of their founder, say Plato, by filling in gaps, by answering objections that competitors have identified, and that in some ways could modify the teaching of the founder, but in a way where the student would claim that they were still adhering faithfully to the teaching of the founder. And so what I wanted to do in comparing the Corinthian viewpoint with Stoicism was to say they were appropriating elements of Stoicism in a way that they're not taking Stoicism wholesale. And in taking Stoicism, they're also taking something from Paul. And so what I saw happening was a sort of competitive appropriation of Stoicism by the Corinthians, where they don't think of themselves as Stoics. They think of themselves as students of the school of Paul. So they have to have doctrinally reformulated his teaching in some way to convince themselves that they were in fact faithful to his teachings, although they were refracting it through the categories of Stoicism, I think, in a fairly systematic way at a particular cross-section within Stoicism.
All of this leads, I suppose, to much more nuance in handling the question of definitions, right? Defining Stoicism is something that you go about in a very particular way, bearing in mind everything you've just said. But maybe you could just on board the listeners, how do you go about defining Stoicism in the non-essentialist terms that you do? What are some of the key issues that you have to put in place in order to make that answer make sense?
Yeah, that's the key, as you said, non-essentialist terms. And so Stoicism is founded by a figure named Zeno around 300 BC. But his doctrines are further systematized and codified by especially his later student, Chrysippus. And over time, you do see, as you would expect, some different inflections even within Stoicism itself. And so what you mean when you talk about non-essentialism is that you can't take something like Stoicism and say it's only Stoicism if it has all of these traits every time. So, for example, there were leading Stoics that denied the Stoic doctrine of a final fiery conflagration in which the universe came to an end, although we tend to think of that as a distinctive of Stoicism. But having rejected or doubted that doctrine, they still held to a large cluster, if not all, of the other distinctives of Stoicism. So as opposed to an essentialist approach to definition, I'm taking an approach typically referred to as family resemblance, where if you have a cluster of typical characteristics and you have enough of them, Stoicism looks one way in this case and one way in this case and one way in this case, but they all have a strong family resemblance to each other. And I argue that looking at it that way, if we compare Stoicism to the Corinthian viewpoint, that we may have enough family resemblance at a particular cross-section to say this is an inflection of Stoicism of some sort.
Yeah, and that helps you then engage, doesn't it, with the text in a much more creative and robust way, I thought. Now, let's just dive in then to part 2, which is really where you're going to do a lot of the exegetical heavy lifting. It's a reading of 1 Corinthians 1-4, as you mentioned earlier on. Let's just dive in. So the first chapter in part 2 begins with 1 Corinthians 1:17-31, where you're contrasting these two logi. What is the significance of this passage for understanding Paul's critique of the Corinthian Sophia? Yeah, how does Paul subvert their self-perception in these opening verses?
Yeah, this is a critical passage because in 1:17 we get the first collocation of the terms Sophia and Logu, right? Wisdom and word, just very basically translated. And what those who advocate for a rhetorical interpretation of this wisdom say is that Paul's dealing with a wisdom of rhetoric or persuasiveness. He's saying, Christ didn't send me to preach eloquently or persuasively using the techniques of rhetoric, which would then invalidate the cross of Christ. And what I argue is that Paul actually is contrasting two kinds of wisdom or two kinds of logoi. So logos, which can be translated word, often means simply an account or a theory. And I think that throughout 1:17 through 25, Paul is actually developing an antithesis between two accounts of the world and how things are. One is a wisdom of the world, and that wisdom prioritizes things like status, achievement, comparison, superiority over others, power. And Paul is contrasting that with the wisdom of God that is embodied in Christ crucified, which seems to epitomize a weakness, but which Paul is saying is in fact wisdom. And if this is true, then it subverts common ways of thinking that are endemic, certainly to Greco-Roman society, but in some ways to all of the way that human beings think, which is that I always want to be recognized for my credentials as being in some ways better than other people. So in 1:26 through 31, Paul then turns and says, look, when you were called, God did not call you based on any credentials. Your calling was not congruous with your worth as that's usually assessed by other human beings. Rather, he called you despite your worth, leaving you no grounds for boasting.
Yeah, well put. So that's straight to chapter 4. So we're effectively just going sequentially through here. The next couple of chapters are dealing with chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians. But in chapter 4, you examine the first 5 verses of chapter 2 and Paul's proclamation of Christ crucified. Maybe you can just unpack your argument in a nutshell there.
Yeah, and this is another important key text for those who advocate the rhetorical thesis, because it seems more clearly than anywhere else to show Paul is denying using rhetoric. And I look at this a little bit differently. And what I see Paul doing is basically applying the principles that he's laid out in 117 through 31 about the wisdom of the cross and lowliness and humility. And he begins to apply it to himself and to show that he became an embodiment of that. So when Paul starts in 2:1 with kago in Greek, and I, so he's laid out the wisdom of God. And he says, and for my part, I embodied this when I was among you. I didn't come trying to impress you with my wisdom. Rather, I came in weakness and in fear and in trembling. And the reason I did this was so that your faith might not be in the world's wisdom of credentialing, but that your faith might be in the power of God, that your faith might be in the idea of Christ crucified.
Yeah, and so it seems to me there then that the cross of Christ is a key way for Paul to deal with factionalism, to deal with the issues with the spiritual Sophia of the Corinthians. Maybe you could speak then, if I'm slightly unfair, but just to speak a little bit more broadly about how you see Paul's theology of the cross relating to this. You know, I was reading Galatians 6 a couple of days ago in my devotionals, where it's about the world being crucified to me and me to the world. You know, can you maybe unpack some of this for listeners who may think it's surprising to talk about the cross at this point?
This is an idea, of course, that we find all over Paul's letters. 1 Corinthians 1 through 4 is one of the great statements of his theology of the cross, or the idea of what we often call cruciformity, kind of cross-shaped life, which we see also in 2 Corinthians 3 through 5, texts like Philippians 2, 4 through 11 with the Christ hymn. And this theology of the cross is really the idea of a world upside down. Naturally, human beings tend towards dominance, status, achievement, self-promotion. And this is why the idea of Christ was such a stumbling block for Paul prior to coming to Christ, was that Christ was disgraced, crucified, lowly, rejected by his own people. And what Paul found when he had his encounter with Christ and became convinced that Christ was Lord is that his values had to be turned upside down, and that, in fact, all of the things that he valued now had to be redefined in terms of the paradigm of Christ and Christ crucified. And this is the point that Paul is driving home in these chapters of 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, beautifully put. I do think this is so important for many to hear as well. This is Paul's theology of the cross, maybe not what people expect. Now to chapter 5, you focus on the rest of chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians, where Paul is describing a spiritual Sophia. Now, as I was dealing with your argument, as I was working my way through, I initially thought that Paul's language of "we have the mind of Christ" might pose a problem for your thesis, that Paul is contradicting the Corinthian Sophia, which they viewed, and as you describe, as a peculiar property of themselves. You know, it sounds an awful lot like what Paul is saying about the mind of Christ. We have the mind of Christ. But actually, you tackle this passage extensively in this chapter, and maybe you could explain how Paul's exclamation that we have the mind of Christ fits in to your developing argument.
Yeah, I think that 2:6 through 16 are really a continuation of the antithesis that he's been developing. And basically there are two ways of thinking. There's the world's way of thinking and there's God's way of thinking. And the only way to come to God's way of thinking is through an epistemological transformation that comes through the Spirit. And so believers have the Spirit. I think what the Corinthian wise men were doing, though, is they had come to see the Spirit as a peculiar property of themselves as human beings, that it was intrinsic to what they were rather than something that was externally given And so you have a key text where Paul in this passage contrasts the wisdom of the world, right? The Sophia to Cosmo with, and then he changes the syntax, the wisdom that is from God. I'm sorry, the spirit. The spirit of the world versus the spirit that is from God. And I think what he's doing in the first case in referring to the spirit of the world in a kind of layered ways, he's referring to the Stoic idea of a spirit or pneuma that actually fills the world. Because it fills the world and fills us, we actually have spirit as part of what we are as human beings. This divine spirit or pneuma. But Paul says you actually have the spirit that is from God, right? The pneuma ta ek tu theou. So it's not something that we have, but it's something that comes from God and is given to us and that we share in. And it's this that gives us the epistemological transformation to see the wisdom of the cross as wisdom. And so when Paul comes at the end of this section to say we have the mind of Christ, I take this consistent with what I see happening to mean the mindset of Christ. We have the way of thinking that embodies Christ crucified and that has been given to us by the Spirit. And so the mind of Christ here I see as analogous to what Paul is saying in Philippians 2:5, for example, where he talks about having that mind in you that is also in Christ Jesus, which he then lays out as a mindset of humility and preferring others above yourself.
Wonderful. And this, of course, will have relevance, just as you have articulated it there, to some of the other debates relating to the material spirit and Volker Rabens and some of his work on this as well. At least that's where my own mind went at that particular point. Now, chapters 6 to 7, you're tackling here some beautiful chapters in Scripture. 1 Corinthians 3 through to 4:5. And you describe that text as addressing both divine wisdom and apostleship. What is the purpose of Paul's extended narrative about himself and Apollos in these chapters? How does Paul use these themes to critique Corinthian factionalism or redefine spiritual maturity?
So the purpose of this section is very commonly believed to be sort of putting Apollos in his place, because Paul speaks at length here about his relationship with Apollos. And some see a kind of hidden script or an attempt to subvert Apollos very subtly. I see Paul actually doing something very different. In talking about himself and Apollos as co-workers, he's presenting them as examples, as exemplars of believers, fellow believers who work together to do God's work and are one, and who don't credit themselves because God gives the growth. So when we come then to 3:10 through 17, there's an interesting shift where Paul begins not to talk about Apollos or any named people. He talks about someone. So if someone lays a different foundation, if anyone thinks that they are wise, or a lot of people think that Paul is here talking about Apollos having come and laid a new foundation and taught a different wisdom. I think that contradicts what Paul has already said about Apollos, which is that they were co-workers that have created the field that is the Corinthians. It's someone else that's laying a different foundation. And I think it's the sophoi or the wise men in Corinth that Paul is not identifying by name. But that's the reason for the shift to that indefinite or anonymous referent. And so as Paul continues into chapter 4, he comes back again to presenting himself and Apollos as stewards of the mystery of the kingdom, as lowly people who are doing God's work and are not evaluating each other in comparison with others.
Yeah, indeed. So, you have I planted, Apollos watered. We're God's servants working together. Yeah, indeed. So it was really helpful to see that development in those verses there. Chapter 8 concludes this section of 1 Corinthians with Paul's portrayal of himself as fall for Christ's sake, as their father through the gospel. How does this passage, where Paul is reflecting a little bit more on his own relationship to them, sum up what he said in the previous chapters?
Right. So here he brings his discussion of himself and Apollos to a close. He says, look, I've just discussed myself and Apollos, when really what we should be talking about is your relationship with each other. He said, the reason I've done this is to give you an example of how you should work together with each other. And so he comes in 4:10 through 13 to this contrast that, as you said, sums up what he's been doing with this antithesis of two kinds of wisdom. He's saying, look, you guys say that you're wise in Christ, that you're strong, that you're distinguished. We apostles say that we're fools, that we're weak, that we're dishonored. And we own that because that's the model that Christ has shown. And if from the world's perspective, this is demeaning, then we simply accept that from their perspective, although it's in fact just the wisdom of God that we embody. And so as Paul finally concludes chapters 1 through 4, he comes back and says, look, I am your father in Christ. But there is an element here of Paul sort of playing on the way that the Corinthians are viewing him, which is, as I argue, is as a teacher and founder of a philosophical school. And Paul says, yes, that's right. I am your teacher, so allow me now to admonish you where I see you straying.
It's a clever little twist, very typical of Pauline rhetoric, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Now, chapter 9, which brings, I believe, the entire second section to an end, I thought was an important chapter. In a nutshell, we've already spoken about this already, but I'd love to hear something a little bit more extended. What is the sub-Stoic wisdom of the Corinthians, and how does it relate to their identity, damage their identity as Christ followers?
Mm. Yeah, briefly, the first thing to say is, how did they come to this Stoicism if they believed that they were getting it from Paul? And we just know so little about their perspective. But I think 2 points are essential where we see an overlap that gives them a point of departure, I think, from which they come from Paul to their sub-Stoicism. One is the idea of the wise man in Stoicism and in Greek philosophy broadly. The wise man was considered the human being par excellence, the perfect human being. And was in fact a kind of divine figure because he was given divine reason. So the wise man is the one who, through use of divine reason, has actualized full human potential. And so this is one kind of category of what's sometimes been called the theos aner, or the divine man. The wise man as philosopher would be one sort of that. And I think if the Corinthians are looking at Paul's portrait of Jesus, they could very easily have interpreted Jesus through the category of the wise man type of divine man. The second key point leads to their view from Paul is the idea of an indwelling spirit, which is obviously there in Paul, which in Stoicism is key as well, because God exists in the form of pneuma or spirit and fills the entire universe as spirit. And it's that indwelling spirit that gives various things the faculties that they have to exist. And I'll pick that thread up in just a second. And so from there, I think there are, I think I lay out maybe 4 ways in which Corinthian sub-Stoicism resembles Stoicism. And I try to show that these are all sort of systemically related ideas. So the first is that when the Corinthians, or some of them call themselves wise men, they are thinking of themselves as wise men in the mode of the Stoic wise man. That category of wise man was really first developed as a technical category by the Stoics. The Stoics also described their wise man using formulas called the paradoxes, which really just means surprising things. So they would say something like, only the wise man is rich, only the wise man is king. And these were not sociological categories, though, for philosophers. It was a way of taking conventional values and applying them in a transcendent way to the wise man. So in what way was the wise man rich? Because he has everything that he needs within, which is his ability to be virtuous, his ability to be happy in all circumstances. In what way was a wise man king? Because he was a master of himself. He ruled over his passions. And the Corinthians then are using these expressions, I think is clearest in 4:8, where Paul says, already you're rich, already you're kings. Very common predicates seen in the Stoic paradoxes, where we actually have examples that say only the wise man is rich and only the wise man is king, as Paul does there. And several other points. Paul uses the language of the paradoxes to describe them. Second is an idea that comes from Stoic physics about tension in the universe. And what that means is the strength with which spirit indwells different things, what they call tanos as tension. And the idea was that spirit indwelled, say, human beings at the highest level of strength. And because of that, we have the faculty of reason, which only humans and God have. Below that, you have spirit infusing, say, animals with a different level of tension, not reaching the threshold to give animals the capacity to reason, but giving them the faculties of movement and sense perception, for example. And so these, just focusing on those two categories, for the Stoics, that was the logikos level of tension, or the reason level, and the psychikos level of tension. And what I see the Corinthians doing is playing on these two levels of tension with one substitution. Instead of logikos or reason tension, they substitute pneumatikos or spirit tension, while then having the same lower category as the Stoics, the psychikos tension. So within the church, then they saw tiers of believers, those that had spirit at the highest level and those that had it at a lower level. So only those with pneumatikos spirit were wise and were perfect. Of course, using the word teleos there, as opposed to those who were psychikos and inferior, immature, or napios. So with this, I see the idea of Stoic self-sufficiency emerging. So a third category here, and that is that if spirit infuses human beings at a level sufficient to give them reason, then we have all that we need to reach the happy life. The philosophers had a slogan, don't look to God for what we can get from ourselves. Happiness is within our reach. We have all that we need because this divinity is a property of what we are as humans. It's not external. It's within each of us. And so the last thing I try to develop here is the way in which their emphasis on the spiritual substitutes for the Stoic emphasis on virtue. And so without trying to develop this too much here, the Stoics said that the only good is virtue, the only vice is moral evil, and that all other things were indifferent. So what would fall into the category of indifference would be things like health or wealth, poverty, sickness. Those things are indifferent. Those things aren't good or bad because they're not virtue or vice. And so I think because the Corinthians have so emphasized spirit, they've put spirit in the place of reason, and in the same way they've put spirit in place of virtue. And so to them, the real standard of value becomes your level of spiritual achievement, your ability to manifest the spirit. And against that standard, one's value is measured. And all who don't have spirit or are able to manifest spirit at the same level would be considered inferior and not spirit people, pneumatikos, but psychikos people.
A beautiful and rich response. Thanks for that. Okay, to the quick fire round. I've just got a cat on my lap at the moment who's purring rather loudly and sniffing the microphone. So if that's being heard, then just be cuted out. Now, do you understand the quick fire round?
Well, I think so. I understand that I don't know the questions.
Exactly. And the idea is just sort of off the cuff responses. One of them is completely unfair, just as a heads up.
Oh, no.
But, we'll get there. So first one, this fun one. If you had to pick one chapter of your book as the most important or exciting, which would it be?
Oh, wow. I think the chapter in the final section where I developed the most speculative part of the thesis. I can't remember if it's 12 or 13. But there, after trying to lay out the case that the wise Corinthians looked at Paul as the founder of a philosophical school, that they were imitating practices of philosophical allegiance to the teachings of the founder, that it's possible they had set themselves up in the house of a man named Titius Justus that's mentioned in Acts, and that it was there that the sort of conception of their school as a philosophical school began to germinate.
Yeah.
Most speculative part of the thesis, and I emphasize that it's totally unnecessary to accepting the general.
Which is fair, yeah.
Yeah.
And now, another quick question. What hobby or interest do you have that might surprise our listeners?
Well, I try to pick up piano in recent years. About 4 years ago, I inherited a piano from my grandmother and spent a couple of years playing. So picking that up as an adult, it wasn't easy, and I don't have a teacher. So I've kind of been out of it for a while, but there's that.
That is wonderful. My boy is learning to play the piano at the moment as well.
Yeah,
and
I wish
tried
I'd started
for about 2 hours and then got discouraged. So, what's your favorite book on Paul in, say, the last 20 years?
Wow. Oh, this is a quick fire round, so I just have to say. So maybe Abraham Malherbe, Paul and the Thessalonians, the philosophical tradition of pastoral care.
Yeah, great.
Really brought the Thessalonian letters alive for me.
Yeah, okay. What two of the most important influences on your work?
So in a methodological way, I'd say Wayne Meeks, the first urban Christians, really sort of in the line of that socio-historical kind of interpretation that I think Bruce Longenecker also represents. Of course, he was my doctor father. And so I'm not sure if this book in particular I'd consider one of the main influences, but Longenecker's sort of work generally. My first year at Baylor, we went through his book, Paul and Poverty, where he does a lot of the socioeconomic scaling that I rely on in the prosopography chapter of my book.
Yeah. If you could change one thing about the way we practice New Testament scholarship, what would it be?
Quickness to follow trends.
Oh, amen to that one. Yes, indeed. Yes. Great answer. Now,
Thank you.
Just a couple more, but how do you feel about the emergence of what I understand to be kind of popular Stoicism in the sort of self-help tradition? Darren Brown, what's his name? Popularized by the scholar William Irving. Have I got that right? William Irving. And
I'm not sure. There are a number of very recent books in self-help on in modern appropriations of Stoicism. This is quick fire still.
Yeah.
Largely antithetical to the wisdom of the cross, the idea of Christ crucified, the idea of human beings as inherently dependent on God. Yeah,
I just came across a Facebook post before we met, Daily Stoic. So it's clearly out there. A lot of it is. Now, here's the unfair one. Just 3 quick ideas. Imagine the person interviewing you is writing a commentary on 2 Corinthians, which I apparently am.
First or second?
2 Corinthians.
Okay.
What's important to draw from your own work for 2 Corinthians?
We have the early chapters of 2 Corinthians are in a way developing this idea of wisdom of Christ crucified, right? With the ministry of reconciliation and these earthen vessels. And so, perhaps thematically, that particular point. Say also in addressing 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, a lot of attempts have been made to connect the super apostles with what's happening in 1 Corinthians 1 through 4 and to associate both of those things with rhetoric. I think if one thing I try to emphasize in my book is that we have to test theories at a really granular level, not just at these grand levels of reconstruction. And that 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, therefore, would have to be evaluated on its own terms for that thesis and shouldn't look too much to what we think is happening in 1 Corinthians 1 through 4.
Great answers. Thank you. Very useful. I will be making notes. Now to part 3, reconstructing the occasion. This is chapters 10 to 12. In chapter 10, you explore the Paul faction, with this self-perception of a philosophical school, how did this cause them to misunderstand Paul and their discipleship?
I thought this was a really great question, and I had to think about it a little bit. And one thing that came to mind was the distinction between most philosophical schools as sects, the word hieresis or sects, that were more or less exclusive but came with certain dogmatic content. In contrast to cynicism, which was not a dogmatic school or hieresis, it was a way of life that did not come with its own extensive dogmatic content. And I started to wonder if the Corinthians, by viewing themselves as a little scholastic community or philosophical school, maybe in the house of Titius Justus, that they were starting to think too much in terms of their dogma that they were developing into a system, as opposed to philosophy as a way of life. The second thing I thought of was the problem of identity, how they identified who they identified themselves with. And Paul, of course, hits this problem immediately in the letter, saying, you say, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, but was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized into the name of Paul? No, we're all one in Christ, into whom we were all baptized. And so, again, if philosophers of that time identified themselves by their teacher or founder, I'm a Platonist, I'm a Pythagorean. In fact, Stoics were initially called Zenonians, right? Paul would say, you're not Paulinists, right? You're Christ followers.
Yeah. And of course, this relates exactly to how you define, or rather deal with, definitions of Stoicism earlier on in the book as well. You sort of loop back to that. Chapter 11 has at its stated purpose, in criticism of a number of really famous, well-known positions, and here I quote you at length, I think, the stated purpose is to demonstrate from ancient sources that philosophy did in fact have perceptible and significant direct influence on the extensive population within the Roman Empire, not just in the most thriving intellectual centers in the Greek East, but also in Roman colonies and in Rome itself, and not just among the highest elites, but also among lower-level magistrates, the middle classes, and more marginalized groups like freedmen, women, and slaves. That comes to the end of that section I've just quoted from your book. Can you tell us how you make this case and why others you think have underestimated the strength of this position?
Yeah. So again, I think this has to do with trends and the swinging of the pendulum. There was a time in the 80s and 90s where we started to appreciate that Corinth in the first century was a Roman colony. It was not the same as the Greek Corinth. And so what you find in studies repeatedly are people saying it's a Roman, not a Greek city, as if everything is now Roman about it. And that then sort of excluding the influence or the visibility of Greek philosophy. But I think that what's also been emphasized is that since ancient schooling was about rhetoric from beginning to end, as it really was, we've sidelined philosophy for that reason also. This is based partly on a one-sided reading of the ancient sources about education. For example, Quintilian, Theon, Cicero, a number of Latin sources from around the first century emphasize that the rhetor order also needs study in philosophy, and they advocated for it very early in the school curriculum. You might find something different in school exercises preserved in papyri, but as far as elite writers on ancient rhetoric, they emphasize the importance of philosophy. But more important than that is a neglect for non-literary sources. And so I spend this chapter in looking at ancient inscriptions primarily. There have been a number of databases that have brought together philosopher inscriptions. There's in fact a 7-volume dictionary of ancient philosophers that catalogs almost 3,000 ancient individuals. And what I do based on that work and some work that's distilled that into geographical representation by school and century, is to show that philosophy was quite prevalent, and that it's not just our Senecas and our Platos and our Epictetuses that were philosophers, but that there were people that are otherwise hidden or lost in the record, except through brief mentions in an inscription that are there that we're just not talking about. And so within the first century, Stoicism was the most prevalent philosophical school. And in first and second century Corinth, we have, in fact, slightly more philosophers on record than we have orators in Corinth at that time. I also looked at the lexicon of Greek personal names online, where you can do a search by profession. And I found that during that time, you had slightly more philosophers acknowledged at that time in the first and second century than orators. And I also noticed that in first century Corinth, we do have at least 2 examples of identifiable Stoics from the middle of the first century. And we have no orators from that particular period. Now, there were more philosophers and more orators in Roman Corinth in the first century than have survived. But I did find it interesting, so we're just pushing back against the view that oratory was so important and so much more popular than philosophy that it's inherently a more plausible background for the Corinthian controversy. And I wanted to show that philosophy was, in fact, much more important and widely attested than people have appreciated.
Yeah. Maybe that is a trend that we should get behind, thinking along those lines. Now, in chapter 12, as suggested in the title, you use I knew I was going to screw this up. Prosopographical methods. I've said it wrong. It's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to repeat it. Maybe you can just first explain what prosopographer, for goodness sake. Can you say it?
Yeah, well, you just anglicized it. That's a perfectly anglicized pronunciation.
Well, just explain first what it is to the listeners.
So this is actually a subfield of classics, and essentially it's the study of ancient persons. So, take somebody who's mentioned in inscription as, Sacibius, the son of Sacibius. And that's the only thing we know about that person from antiquity. Well, we catalog these individuals and we can sort of trace who they are and gather as much information as we can about each of them. So if we're doing a prosopographic analysis of individuals in Paul's churches, we're sort of saying, let's gather all of the information that we know about these people and decide what sort of profile can we build based on that information. And so this was done first in Wayne Meek's First Urban Christians. Gerd Tyson has done this. More recently, Stephen Friesen and Bruce Longenecker, trying to scale individuals in the Corinthian church and say how far or low are they on the socioeconomic scale, based on things like, did they hold public offices? Do their names indicate Roman citizenship? They have the ability to travel, to give gifts, to support Pauline's ministry. And what you find when you look at ancient philosopher inscriptions is that most people in the Greek East at that time who identify as philosophers in inscriptions were actually magistrates in those cities, which would have put them roughly at the elite level, the lower elite level. So what I needed to know is, were there Corinthians, members of the church, that approximate that socioeconomic level? Since most self-identifying philosophers were there. Although I do point out, as you read in the quotation, that there were philosophers represented at all social levels, among men, women, children, adults. So my thesis wasn't dependent on this, but I wanted to say people who had a formal education in philosophy extensively were more likely higher class than lower. My goal was not to identify which Corinthians belong to the wise group. There's no way to know. And Paul certainly doesn't mention everyone who's a member of the community. And Paul has a tendency not to name opponents in his letters as well. So his opponents here could be unnamed individuals. My purpose, though, was to see whether it was plausible that you had Corinthians at that socioeconomic level, sort of lower elite, upper middling level, just to see, do people meet the criteria for candidacy in the group of people likely to be philosophically educated? And what you find is that Erastus certainly was. There's been some debate about Erastus and his social level from a number of studies. But in Romans 16:23, Paul identifies him as a Corinthian and as the aedile of the city of Corinth. And the most recent studies have persuasively shown that Erastus here is, in fact, identified as an aedile, although Paul calls him oikonomos, and that did identify him as one of the highest elites in the city of Roman Corinth. Other candidates include Gaius, who had a fairly large home, apparently. And I would include Titius Justus, although he's only known from Acts. He does provide Paul with hospitality and shelter while Paul was in Corinth after he's ejected from the synagogue. So I don't know that any of these individuals were necessarily members of the Paul faction. Based on the most speculative part of my thesis, I suggest, well, maybe Titius Justus's home was the center for this philosophical activity, but there's no way to know. But I think that I successfully showed that it is plausible that you had in the Corinthian church male Gentile members who are of higher socioeconomic class that plausibly fit the profile of a typical educated philosopher.
Yeah. Certainly, the more speculative claims come out in chapter 12, though quite plausible when I think of some work on 1 Corinthians 8 and 6 and 11. But anyway, maybe you could summarize just the main, I mean, you've already done this a little bit in the quickfire round, but just the main points of your argument in this important chapter.
The most important point is the plausibility of candidates in the Corinthian church for membership in this group. I don't know that Gaius, Erastus, or Titius Justus were any of them in it. But plausibility is important. If you have a church of, say, 10 artisans, as you might have had in the Thessalonian church, how plausible is it that some of them had an extensive philosophical education, the leisure to study with a philosopher? Not very high. I think the situation is different in the Corinthian church.
Well, I do want to ask just a couple more questions. I know we're running out of time, but let me just ask you a more general one. You know, how do the themes of wisdom, boasting, factionalism in 1 Corinthians resonate with the challenges faced by the contemporary church? And let's just keep it, open-ended there, that particular, rather than a locale. In what ways might your own arguments help us hear the arguments in 1 Corinthians 1-4 as a word in season for us today?
I think it's a perennial human problem that we value strength, power, credentials. And so you see that in you could see it in any kind of church, but it's easier to see, I think, in a mega church that centers around a strong personality in the pulpit, who say is good looking, they have an image, maybe they drive a nice car, they have charm, they have speaking abilities, and we esteem these people for those qualities, not necessarily for the qualities that have much to do with the gospel or the way of Christ. And we see that, I think, in politics also, the way in which even, say, evangelicals in America tend to vote in a certain way when they see a candidate as strong, powerful, even domineering and bullying, which they can overlook because it supports their side.
Yeah, well put. Undermining the reality of the cross. Timothy, what's next for you?
Wow, I've come off a rapid burst of publications over the last 5 or 6 years. So what I've tried to do is just clear the agenda for now. I have a book coming out in May with Hendrickson, An Introduction to Greek and Roman Philosophy for Students of the New Testament.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm excited about that one. And having gotten that one off my desk was my last major item on my agenda. I'll be contributing some essays to the series New Documents Illustrating Early Christianity, the Thessalonica and the Corinthian volumes. And that's as far as I've planned at this point. Trying to take a break, and I'm trying to be very selective and thoughtful about the next major project.
Wonderful. And maybe finally, what's the one thing you hope your readers take away from this fantastic book?
Well, apart from everybody accepting the thesis, I suppose it would be the wider influence of the idea of the wisdom of the cross, as opposed to the self-help culture today, as seen partly in the surge of Stoicism today, as you mentioned. That culture is antithetical to the ideas of our self-limitations. our dependence on God, although we often don't recognize it, and the idea that we ought to embrace humility and lowliness, and that domination, although it's often valued, is antithetical to the cross, and it doesn't solve our problems, right? Domination leads to an escalating cycle of domination, and then what breaks that cycle is love. Yeah. Love conquers all. And in dealing with that in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul is really just talking in another way about the wisdom of the cross.
Yeah. That
service, giving up our own interests, living so-called in weakness for the sake of others is love, and it's the solution.
Beautiful answer. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for joining us. This was Chris Tilling talking to Timothy Brookins about his book, Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Corinthians. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.